All right, I think we've got a few more trickling in people, so we'll get going for our final keynote speaker. It's my honor today to introduce Bob Yeager. Let me grab my screen here. Sorry about that. And here we go. All right, so Bob is from the HPP class of 1984. He is the president of Partners for Sacred Places, America's only national nonprofit organization dedicated to maximizing older religious properties for assets as assets for both congregations and their communities. He co-founded Partners in 1989 and has overseen 2 rounds of research with the University of Pennsylvania on the civic value of sacred places that has informed the development and delivery of resources that support the value, including the New Dollars, New Partners training program, the National Fund for Sacred Places, and the Arts in Sacred Places program. Before founding Partners, Bob was the senior vice president of the Philadelphia Historic Preservation Corporation and founder of its Historic Religious Properties Preservation Program. He is author or co-author of multiple books and volumes. He was the founding editor and columnist for Inspired Magazine and is the editor of Sacred Places Magazine. Bob has presented or lectured at national and international conferences, such as What Future for Which Churches in Quebec, Amazing Spaces in Indianapolis, Indiana, and Icons of Faith in Lubbock, Texas. He has accepted a National Preservation Award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Conover Award from the Faith and Form Interfaith Design International Awards Program for Religious Art and Architecture, and the F. Otto Haas Award from Preservation Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Again, it's also my pleasure to add to this list today and share that Bob will be receiving the James Biddle. What do we have here? Sorry about that. Was that me? Hopefully it wasn't. Okay, we'll start that over. So it is my pleasure today to add to that list that Bob will be receiving the James Biddle Award for Lifetime Achievement in Historic Preservation from the Preservation Alliance of Greater Philadelphia this Wednesday, June 8th, at the 2022 Preservation Achievement Awards in Philadelphia. Biddle, of course, was one of America's foremost preservationists, defending and protecting landmarks like the Grand Central Terminal and the U.S. Capitol building. He was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as president of the National Trust, where membership under his tenure between 1968 and 1980 grew to 150,000. Biddle's legacy is important to note in this introduction, as Bob has also proven himself to be a leading figure in preservation. So it's obvious why Bob will be receiving such an honorable award. And we're so pleased to have him here to speak with us today. And without further ado, Bob, I will stop sharing and hand it over to you.
Well, thank you. It's really an honor. I really loved hearing bits and pieces of the earlier presentations, and I'm really grateful to everybody. I love my years at Cornell. I had a very minor role in the beginning of HPPA back in the 1980s. And I just am so, tickled that it has done such good work over the years. And so thank you to Mayar and Michelle and Zoe. Thank you all for being so welcoming. And I just hope I can share a bit about what we've been doing, which I think might interest you intellectually and maybe has some practical value too. And hopefully do it fairly quickly so there's a little time for Q&A. Does that sound good? Great. Okay, let's see if I can share my screen. Great. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
I need to make this bigger. Let's see. The Zoom.
Down at the bottom there on the right, yep, go over to the right. There's that sort of preservation, or sorry, not preservation, presentation. My mind is a little bit over to the left. Yep, that one right there. That should be it.
All right, thank you. I should know this. I've done so many Zoom things.
Yeah.
as we all have, right? So you know, you can probably imagine, a lot of us do a lot of public speaking, and I know I do. I love conversational presentations that may or may not be practical since we're all, you know, in our respective homes and offices, but you guys feel free to jump in with questions. You don't have to wait to the end. It's kind of fun to be conversational along the way. So, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat room, but probably better just to speak up. So I'm using this term transitioning, and a lot of old and dear friends like Barb Ebert and Susanna Brucco. Susanna's here in Philadelphia, like I am, have followed this work over the years, and so may know this term. When I say transitioning, I mean that congregations and their buildings are changing in their use, the intensity of their use, the viability of the institution, perhaps changes in ownership. Arguably, along with industrial buildings, sacred places have been transitioning more than any other building type in America, and therefore are more at risk than any other building type right now. So I think there's a lot of interesting lessons to be learned from what we're seeing in the field. So I do hope you'll find this useful wherever you may be working. So what are we seeing today with sacred places and congregations? And by the way, you'll soon see that obviously we deal with buildings and we care about the buildings, but we deal very much with the institutions that are in those buildings. That's, I think, why we've had an impact. So I'll talk a lot about both the physical object as well as the life inside that building throughout this conversation today. So what are we seeing? Well, none of this will be shocking to you if you're paying attention to what's happening in your city or your town. Congregations, generally speaking, are shrinking. There are exceptions. There is a mega church. Some parishes are gaining from an influx of Hispanic congregants or parishioners, for example. So there are some exceptions, but in much of the Northeast, where I am, or the Midwest, or even the West Coast, with the exception of Southern California, a lot of congregations, particularly mainline, the older denominations, are shrinking. They have fewer people, they have fewer resources. So we'll talk more about that. Consequently, those buildings tend to be underused. A lot of the things that used to happen in these buildings, like Sunday schools and weekly dinners and all kinds of other parish or congregation events, are not happening as much anymore. So there's a lot of space that could be used in new ways. So it's a problem, and it's also an opportunity. And the other thing that we talk about a lot is that even though these buildings are everywhere and people are vaguely aware that congregations are shrinking, a lot of our civic leaders really don't understand what's going on. They're not paying close attention. And when I say civic leaders, I mean mayors, city councils, foundations, business people, you know, the people, the movers and shakers in our towns and cities are not really aware of what's going on. When I talk around the country, I often say that when that kind of civic leader drives down the street and looks at that church, they really have no idea what goes on behind those walls. They think it's a place of worship. And I don't even use that term anymore, by the way, place of worship, because it's misleading. It indicates what happens on Sunday morning or Friday night or Saturday morning, depending on the tradition. But it tells you nothing about what happens during the week. So, and congregations are terrible at telling their stories. We'll talk more about that. They don't really explain themselves. They don't tell what's going on in their buildings. And therefore, people are not appreciative of them and are not willing to help as much as they should. So we'll talk about all those things today. Here's a rather chilling and sobering graph, which shows that in only 20 years, the number of people, the median number of people coming to worship in your average congregation has dropped by half in only 20 years, from 137 to 65. So there are a lot of small congregations out there. And if you follow what's happened in Western Europe or in Canada, it's all happened there. We were kind of considered the exception, but we're no longer the exception. The same phenomenon is happening here as well. And the pandemic has probably made things worse, particularly for the smaller, more vulnerable congregations. So what we've been seeing for 20, 30, 40 years is accelerating in many cases. Small congregations are smaller, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're hearing someone's background noise, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm having trouble muting. Oh, there we go. She muted. I couldn't mute her myself. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick word on the pandemic, which Trudy mentioned this, and I think others have mentioned this in the course of the last 2 days. There are going to be some longer term implications of this pandemic, I'm sure. Looking at sacred places, some of the programs that these buildings used to house had to leave, and some of that's not coming back. Some of the people who came to worship over the last few decades are not coming back. And so even though congregations, both Christian and Jewish and other, have kind of somewhat gone back to normal, they're not the same in terms of their size or in terms of what they house. So there's going to be some longer term implications. Basically, the more vulnerable congregations are now more vulnerable. And we're going to see a lot of closings in the coming 10 or 20 years. But what I want to talk about most today is not the vulnerability, but the value of sacred places. And you know what's been interesting about my work over the last 35 years is that I started off, and Michael will remember this, I started off loving Tiffany Glass and the Akron Platin Sunday School and you know, church architecture and design, which I still love to this day. And so I started in the field knowing a lot about the building, and to be effective, I've had to learn a lot more about the institution in the building and how it functions and how it ticks and what problems it's having and what opportunities it's having. And so that's what led us to these 2 rounds of research that Zoe mentioned a moment ago with the University of Pennsylvania. Interestingly, not with the School of Architecture, not with city planning, not with religious studies, not with a seminary, but with the School of Social Work. So we're doing work because, of course, we care about these buildings, but we work with social work. Why? Because that field has been really interested in the role of religious institutions in serving people's needs, the hungry, the homeless, single parent households, English as a second language, all the many things that go on out there to help people in need. And there have been researchers, somewhat prompted by our work, that have been looking closely at that. And so we did our first study in the 90s, and I still find this kind of amazing to this day. It had never been done before. Basically, what goes on in our sacred places during the week? That was the question. And we called it Sacred Places at Risk. And of course, that's a part of the story, but that wasn't the main issue. The main issue was what in the heck happens in these buildings on the non-worship day, on a Tuesday or a Wednesday or Thursday. And interestingly, no one knew. This is not that long ago. Some of you are very young. Maybe you were born after the late 1990s, but that wasn't so long ago. And at that point, seminaries did not know, religious studies programs did not know, denominational offices did not know. No one knew what in the heck happened in these buildings in the course of the week. And so we did a random sampling of older and historic sacred places in 6 cities. And this is one of the primary things we learned. And if there's anything that you may remember from today, I hope it's this pie chart, which is that 4 out of 5 of the people served in these buildings by the programs like feeding programs, after school programs, clothing, arts, whatever, 4 out of 5 being served are not members of that congregation. And it begins to say that these are civic assets. These are community centers. Yes, they're places of worship, but they are so much more. So we also learned that almost every congregation opens its doors, that most of what congregations do to serve people happens in their building. So the building, these great buildings that we love so much, they are the headquarters for most of what congregations do. We've learned there's a lot of volunteer time, both members and non-members who volunteer time to serve the soup or to attend to the kids or serve as ushers for the concert program or whatever it is they may do. and a lot of basic stuff: clothing, shelter, food, culture. And I touch on here who they serve: kids, a lot of kids, and basic needs. And I mention this because one of the things we try to do is help congregations raise money for their buildings to do capital campaigns. And their complaint often is, well, nobody's interested in religion. Well, there's some truth in that. But one approach when a congregation's raising capital funds is to talk about not about the religious side, but about their community service side and who are they serving, right? And here we see they serve kids. So a foundation may not be interested in religion, but they often care about kids or the arts or the homeless or seniors or whatever other population or cause the congregation serves. So this is a hint at some of what we talk to congregations about. By the way, this is Arch Street Methodist Church, 1865 vintage in downtown Philadelphia. I should have been identifying some of the other buildings. I'll try to do better. So that study led to a second study, which I think was even more important, because the first study was looking mostly at how are congregations sharing their space? What's happening in these buildings? What value are they bringing? When they take that old Sunday school wing and it's now a center for kids during the week from low-income families, what is that gift of that space if they're not charging much rent or any rent? What's that gift? So that was important. But now we realized, this is now 15, 20 years later, that there is a lot more that happens in these places. There's a lot more value that they bring. And we decided to call this the halo effect of a sacred place. So if you can picture a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a temple on a map, you can see these kind of radiating circles of influence in that neighborhood that goes out from that building. And so, of course, it's a nice play on words to call it the halo effect. So it's been very effective in kind of capturing all the ways in which these buildings influence their communities. And I'll kind of get into some details. By the way, I don't know if does anybody recognize this church? Surely someone does. It's one of the great churches in Rhode Island. First Congregational Church in Newport, entirely designed and painted by John Lafarge, the great painter and the great competitor to Tiffany in terms of influencing late 19th century decorative arts. So this is all Lafarge. So here's what we learned in the second study. And by the way, I think it's kind of interesting when I look back on this, that here we are, we are a preservation group, but we've had to do fundamental research that no one else is doing in order to make our case that these are buildings worth preserving. And by the way, as a little aside, one of the things I've learned, I don't know about you all in your respective jobs, but in my job in nonprofit world, what I've learned is there are only so many funders that care about preservation. Just to be honest, in Philadelphia, where I am, or most cities, there are only so many donors that care. But there are a lot more donors that care about neighborhoods or about the populations that we've been talking about that need help. And so that's why we had to make a different kind of case. Architecture ain't enough. And it's about culture, and it's about identity, and it's about outreach, and it's about economics. So the second study found that your average urban congregation, and we've subsequently done a study for rural, but this is urban. Your average urban congregation brings an economic value of $1.7 million each year, which is astoundingly high for those who never thought about it much. And we still have people say, well, churches and synagogues and temples, they bring no value because they don't pay taxes. What are they doing? What value? I mean, they're places of worship and they don't contribute to the commonweal. And we're saying, well, wait a second now. They have budgets, they spend money, most of it stays in the community, they hire people, they hire contractors. When they fix the steeple or they fix the walls, they're hiring people, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll talk about some of the components. So, it's the same argument that cities make for convention centers and stadiums, that these are going to bring economic value to the community. And so for every large civic project, there are lots and lots of congregations doing the same thing. So the direct budgets of a congregation is about a third of that $1.7 million. And here's what's interesting, the lower bar chart. So this sample was 90 congregations across several cities. But look, see, these are not big congregations. Look at the average, 53 out of the 90 are spending less than $100,000 over 5 years on their buildings. That's $20,000 a year for these. And you know how enormous these buildings can be. They're not spending a lot. These are not big, wealthy institutions. They don't have a lot. And yet their spending in the community has a big impact on those neighborhoods. I think this is one of the most interesting things we've been learning. And that is that most of the people coming and going to these places are not coming for worship. This is a different way to look at what that statistic I mentioned earlier. So these 90 congregations, interestingly, only 90 of them had almost 3.7 million people coming back and forth over the course of a year. Pretty astonishing, right? But look at the percentage coming from worship, 11%. It's shockingly low. So the vast majority are coming for outreach programs, education like schools or daycare centers, after school programs, or other events. And so when I talk to congregations, I'll say, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? 11%. Anybody have an opinion?
It's a thing.
It's a thing. It's a thing. It is what it is. Well, I mean, if you talk to church folks or people active in their faith community, they find that alarming, that so few of the people coming in are coming for worship, and they want more people to come for worship. They want their congregations to grow. On the other hand, what it's saying is, again, these are civic places. Now, if congregations can learn to tell that story, they might be able to take care of their buildings better because people would help them do so. They would, hey man, we're Methodist or we're Buddhist or we're Catholic or whatever we are, but really we're a civic place and people are coming for other reasons. So when we need to fix the roof or replace the boiler, will you help us? And that's one of the things we do, is try to teach that and help congregations articulate their value. By the way, on the right-hand side, we talk about the magnet effect. So when a place of worship, a sacred place, does things that bring people to the community and they spend money in the community, we call that the magnet effect. Again, it's the same argument made for stadiums. People come in and they buy dinner and they stay overnight and they go shopping. Well, again, for every large civic project, there are dozens and dozens of sacred places doing this all the time. So they have a magnet effect as well. So that's about 22% of that 1.7 million. And we again looked at the percentage of people being served that are members versus non-members. Now, 15 years have passed since that first study, and the old number was 81%, and it's now 87%. It's getting close to 90. We don't entirely know why. It may reflect that congregations are smaller and smaller, and therefore the percentage of people being served is likely to be, non-members versus members. But we don't know for sure. But it helps to buttress the case that we're making. And a lot of people's lives are impacted. People find employment. People get off drugs. People learn English as a second language. We didn't monetize these. They're not in that $1.7 million, but it's important to acknowledge the impact that these places have. And they're incubators. A lot of nonprofits have started. I was a member of First Presbyterian Church in downtown Philadelphia, and it hosted the beginning of a group called Manna, which was formed to make and deliver hot meals to people who were homebound with HIV and AIDS back in the 80s. And it's grown and grown. That even though HIV is a different issue now, it's like in its third or fourth location. But First Presbyterian Church hosted that and got it going back in the 80s. That's an example of incubation. So how do we manage this? And by the way, we're going to be speaking at the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions conference in Cincinnati in July, because this transitioning question is an important question that they're facing at the local level. And what should they know and what can they do? So that's one of the questions we're facing. And we just got a grant to hire a full-time director of transitioning services. So you might want to know about that for your own community, to help congregations discern a good path forward if they need to rethink the way they use or own their building. But before I go there, here are some basic things we teach. Why should help congregations address the question, why in the heck should people care about us? Because when they were 500 people, it didn't matter. But when they're 50 people, it matters. They've got to get others interested. They cannot do it by themselves. Otherwise, they ain't going to be there in 10 or 20 years. They need to work with architects. They need to do better planning. They need to know what their buildings are facing. Again, they need to tell their story to donors and funders that would care. And they need to talk to their neighbors about how they use their space. Again, I'll give you a good example. I'm from Detroit, and we did a little project for a local foundation on a bunch of churches on Woodward Avenue. I don't know if anybody knows Woodward, but it's kind of the main street. And we went to Mr. Kresge's home church of Kresge and Kmart fame. And he was a Methodist, and it's called Metropolitan Methodist Church on the main street of Detroit, Woodward Avenue. And I went inside. It's just this enormous 1920s, 1930s Deco Gothic church. Huge spaces, just enormous spaces everywhere. And they're barely used. And no one knows. No one's paying attention. And they have a big endowment, so they will survive. But there are a lot of other churches that won't. So how can they engage with their community and together think about ways to use that space again? So again, and for transitioning, we have a guide on this. If you're interested, it's on our website and you can download it, or we can send you a copy, a hard copy. But congregations need to discern what's happening and think about their path forward. They need to make choices. One of the simple things is to use their space in new ways, to share their space in new ways. That's a very big part of it. But they may need to do something a little more radical. They may need to co-own their building with another congregation. They may need to sell their building and lease it back. Lease back the sanctuary, perhaps. Some churches have done that. Or they may need to sell. But we're making the argument, if you're going to sell, do it in a civic-minded way. And again, you all may see some of this happening where you live. This is one of the biggest challenges, because if congregations shrink and shrink and they're not thinking ahead, what's going to happen is they or their denomination is just going to put it on the market and get a realtor and walk away from it. And some of the denominational leaders we deal with, they'll tell you that's all they care about. They want to get rid of it. And we're trying to say, no, 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 no. This is your legacy. You cared about that community for the last 100, 150 years. So if you have to leave, do it in a civic-minded way. So we talk a lot about that. Now, just to give you a hint at some of our basic resources, I do want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. We've spent the last 15 years trying to find ways to build the capacity of these institutions to do some of the things we're talking about. We call it new dollars and new partners for your sacred place. And I mentioned this briefly before. A part of it is helping them make a better case. They need a case statement. They need to explain why, there may be 5 or 10 or 15 reasons for people to care. It may be architecture. It may be acoustics. It may be a program that served kids for a long time. It may be it holds that corner. It's an essential part of the streetscape. But what are all the reasons that people should care? And how do you discover people you could work with? And how do you find new funding? One of the interesting and encouraging bits of data that we've gathered is that if a congregation does this better, if it tells its story better and it reaches out to the community, 2/3 of their capital funds can come from non-members, which is very encouraging for a small congregation, that they can reach out and much of the money they raise. And so it kind of opens up the field for them. So again, this is an example of a training group that we had here in Philadelphia, and those are some of the things we teach. We also help them do asset mapping. If you're familiar with asset-based community development, we teach that to congregations so that they can look at their buildings as a bundle of assets, not just a bundle of problems, and then invite the community in to see how they can connect their assets to the assets of the larger community and bring them together to do something new, to host something new. So that, by the way, here, those Post-it notes each represent an asset. And so when this is a public event, so typically there are dozens and dozens and dozens of assets, but congregations need to kind of be taught to look at their buildings in a new way. And so this is a public event here, actually for a seminary that we did this with in Philadelphia, but the same process works for individual congregations. By the way, this whole process is an aha moment for congregations who often feel very deflated and discouraged and fatalistic about their future. And this gives them a lot of hope. And then we do design charrettes, which can follow the asset mapping, where architects are brought in to help them reimagine their space in a preservation-minded way. And we'll typically work with the local chapter of the AIA, and they almost always will help recruit volunteers, architects who will do this pro bono, to help, again, imagine how that Sunday school wing or how that parish hall might be reused or shared. And just a couple of case examples. Back to St. Paul's, the church behind me here. Some of you know St. Paul's. This has been the cathedral from time to time, but right now their parish house is completely empty. And they've been puzzling over how to bring it back to life. And they are in the middle of a downtown that's beginning to show some resurgence. So they wanted to connect to that. So they did all the things we've talked about. They've done some capacity building. They formed an advisory group from the community. They did asset mapping, and they did a design charrette. They did it so well that they came to the National Fund for Sacred Places, which is something we run with the trust. And they got a major grant, $250,000 grant, to help them do some of the improvements they needed to do. Another one is University Lutheran. You see it right here. This is a really wonderful mid-century church that won the Boston Society of Architects award for best new building in like 1951. But you can see how compressed they are. It's a very densely built up area right about a block from the Harvard campus. So, but they did the same thing. They gathered advisors from the community. They learned how to articulate their value. They gathered the community to think about the assets of their building and how they could be put to better use. And then they did a design charrette. And again, this is the Boston area, of course, and there were like a dozen really fine architects who volunteered 2 or 3 days of their time to help do this design charrette. And here are some of their drawings that indicate how their building could be extended a bit and used in new ways to serve the homeless and to serve the arts. So basically, this is a period of enormous change. I don't think this is shocking to you. You're probably seeing it wherever you live and wherever you work. And I think what's kind of interesting about the work we've been doing is that, yes, we still talk about how to fix the steeple and how to fix the glass, but we're really dealing with the fundamentals of the institution. We have to understand it. We have to be able to communicate to them. We have to be seen as a resource and not as a constraint. We have to help them reconnect with their community, because a lot of these congregations are now commuting from other parts of the city. They don't know that neighborhood as well as they used to. They don't know those leaders like they used to. So they find this whole process to be energizing and enlivening and exciting. You know, simple things like inviting a few civic leaders to come in for breakfast one morning and to walk around the building and talk about what they see. And what they see could be opportunities to share their space and bring new people into the building and maybe new revenue, but it makes new friends and it creates new allies for the congregation. So I've raced through a lot of things here, and it's a lot of data, forgive me, but that's what we're all about these days. And I think one last comment, you know, I think I saw this in the early days. We have a lot of parallels with Main Street in the sense that, like Main Street, yes, we care about the buildings being preserved, but we have to talk about the purpose of the institutions we serve. And Main Street, of course, is serving small businesses, right? And their primary purpose is not building preservation. It's to make a profit. It's to have a successful business. We have to do the same thing here. These congregations care about their buildings, but that's not their primary purpose, of course. It's worship, it's outreach, it's ministry. And so you have to talk that language. That's kind of what we've learned. And we have to understand what's going on in these buildings, which has led us to that research. So I'm going to pause now for any questions.
Thank you, Bob. That was awesome. Always thought-provoking. I had the pleasure to have you in class last year as well, and it's just always like I'm always taking lots of notes whenever you're talking. So yes, we'll open it up for questions. Use the chat function or raise your hand, and we'll do as we've been doing. I can, oh, okay, go ahead, Meyer.
So Bob, thank you very much for this presentation. I really enjoyed the way that you think about, or the way that you change the way that I think about preservation. My thinking just like changed. So you're basically trying to teach these, let's call them places of worship, to represent themselves as a civic center that has a tiny bit of it for a place of worship. And then you, with that, they try to basically do the fundraising and rehabilitate their building to have new functions. Is that correct?
That's a very big part of it.
These are basically not places that already have those civic activities.
Well, you know, yes and no, and it's kind of two sides of a coin. The research I shared tells you a lot's happening, right? They're sharing their space. They have this great value. On the other hand, if you turn the coin over, there's a lot more they can do, right? So they do good things, but often they have these enormous spaces. So they're only just scratching the surface. There's so much more connecting they can do, more space sharing they can do, more of an impact they can have. And so, you know, what we're not denying at all their religious purpose, of course, because that's what drives them. That's really important.
Yeah, of course.
You need to understand that's what motivates them. But yeah, so they do good work, but there is a lot more they can do.
I see what you mean.
That's both.
And one more quick, another question. So you mentioned that you try to kind of teach them that they shouldn't walk away from the property, and if they want to do it, they should do it more civically. What do you mean by that? Like how they can do it if they have to walk away?
Good question. Well, the first step is to anticipate and not be panicked, because if you wait too long, you're panicky, and you have no choices. But when we say civic-minded, we mean, you know, talk to your neighbors and think about together what this building means and what it could be. Might that mean that you might get a little less money when it's sold? Perhaps. But if you've cared about that neighborhood, if you've cared about those people all these years, why would you stop caring when you need to sell? Or, you know, maybe you don't need to sell outright. Maybe you collaborate with another institution. Maybe they buy it and you keep a presence. Or maybe you find the kind of buyer that continues your community presence, you know, like maybe it's an arts group or maybe it's a social service agency. And maybe they could continue some of the outreach that you've done all these years. Now, it gets complicated with congregations that are part of a hierarchical system where there's a diocese or there's a presbytery or a conference overseeing it, which often has a lot of say or may completely control the process when a building is sold. Then you have to get them involved. And, even the liberal denominations who are theoretically progressive and community minded are, even they can be very uninterested in the fate of a building if they feel pressed, or if they feel like, like they just need to be rid of a burden, and they can reap the rewards, get some money and put it into another church. I mean, they will defend it by saying, well, we're going to help other congregations. And that may be true, but the point we're making is, do this collaboratively. Just like we're saying, if you're going to stay, do it collaboratively. Don't do this alone. If you have to leave, or if you're thinking of transitioning, do that collaboratively too. Don't do it by yourself. Part of the problem is, though, these clergy people are not used to talking to their neighbors anymore, and they need to be reconnected. So, we just did this asset mapping, a little modest example of asset mapping with a small church in northern Indiana. And it was just like 6 or 7 people spending an hour. And it was breathtakingly powerful for that rector and those lay people to see the interest of civic leaders coming in, people who cared about kids and music and all that. And they walked around the building, and then they had coffee, and they talked about what they saw. And within weeks, new things started to happen in the building. Those people wanted to collaborate with the congregation. So it's very, very powerful. They could have done this on their own. They didn't really need us, but they do sometimes need a little prompting and a little bit of structure. And that's something that Partners is able to do, or you could do. They just sometimes need a little helping hand to begin those conversations.
I think that structure is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I might use my moderator power here to step in. I have a quick question. I'll preface by saying that I did my thesis, I presented yesterday and talked a little bit about how I looked at the history of a municipal baseball stadium, a minor league stadium in Elmira, Dunn Field, and the history that I found was that the baseball history there was very much connected to the Roman Catholic community in town. And this isn't really a fully prepared thought, but it's interesting because just this past year in 2021, the Saints Peter and Paul Church, the congregation was closed down because of lack of attendance and funding that was declining. And that's really the trend that we're seeing with Dunn Field too, and the baseball team. And so it's kind of an interesting parallel that there's this history connection parallel there. And today we're seeing that those same trends. And I just wonder, maybe it's a stretch, but if you thought that maybe one or the other was sort of an indicator, again, thinking of these places as civic spaces, you indicated that stadiums and sacred places are very similar in that way as well. So a lot of thoughts. I don't really know where to go with that, but I just wanted to share with you.
Well, I can see the parallels, and they could rise together and then maybe fall together. I think part of what we're talking about is redefining places. And hopefully before it's too late, before then you're really at a crisis when a building or a resource is empty and not used. But part of what, I don't think I've used that word quite yet, but part of what we're doing is redefining places. Because the problem is, if it's defined solely as Methodist or Lutheran or Catholic or Jewish or whatever it is, then it feels like it's excluding everybody else. If you don't belong to that faith group, then you're not a part of this, right? And but we don't want to deny that part either. That's something very precious. But how do we respect that, but say, but it's more than that. These places tend to be welcoming. They don't tend to discriminate. They don't, by and large, they don't tend to proselytize. They tend to welcome everybody in need. So they are this civic resource. So how do we help America to understand that? How do we help our local civic leaders to understand that? One of the problems is there are still so many of them that I think it's not sunk in what the cumulative effect will be when many, many, many of them close. And the church you mentioned in Amira is just one example of many, 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 many they're going to close. And we're the canary in the coal mine, all of us. We are, because we're noting this. We're saying, hey, you know, this is coming. I mean, it's maybe not the tsunami yet, but it's a big wave, and it's going to be a tsunami. So one of our next research questions might be, okay, we know the value of any given congregation. What if most of them close in a given neighborhood, or most of them close in a given downtown? What's the cumulative effect? You know, again, it's a civic thing. It's not so much about all those worship services ending. It's about all the good that they do or could do. So, so we have to redefine them and say, you know, don't think of it as just Methodist. And it's not just us preservationists. That congregations need to do this. They're terrible at telling their story. You know, when you drive by again and you look at that sign outside your typical church, I often ask this question when I'm talking to church people. I'll say, what does that sign say? Well, it says the name of the congregation. It says maybe when it was founded. It says when the worship occurs, and they have the name of the pastor or the clergy person. But does it tell you anything about what happens in that building during the week? No, almost nothing. Well, that's crazy. That's crazy. They're not telling their story. They're not letting people know. So, you know, that helps redefine, because then you're thinking, oh, well, that's not just Methodists coming in on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. It's all these other things on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, you know. And now this may seem elemental to us, but I'll tell you, this is like stunning for a lot of faith leaders. They're just not thinking that way.
Thank you. I think we'll go over to Gretchen next.
Thanks. Thank you, Bob, for that presentation. I've been such an admirer of your organization for so long. And I think we either were in email contact or we're about to be through Hannah about a church in Auburn about 1.5 years ago.
Oh, that rings a bell.
Yeah. Anyway, I have 2 questions for you. One is, are you ever contacted by local governments who would like to, you know, either in terms of abandoned or vacant churches, would like your input, expertise on how the local government, the planning department, whomever, may be able to work to improve or to change or to transition a vacant church?
Rarely. And two footnotes to that answer, because it's not much to add except it's rare. Now there's a foundation in Reading, Pennsylvania, which is a small old industrial town. If you've ever been there, it's a lovely city. So it's not government, but it's a community foundation. They are working with us to survey all their older churches, not for the architecture as much, although that's part of it, but to get a sense of what condition are they in, how are they used, are they vacant or semi-vacant. And we want to work with them to encourage their peer foundations, because community foundations are naturals for this. They care about those neighborhoods, and yet they're not necessarily thinking about the fate of these places. That's one footnote. The other footnote is, one of the reasons we're excited to go to NACP conference is because we want to tell, I mean, it's a big conference. I think it's like maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people there. And those folks should know about this because they're worried about these emptying churches, right? So we want to tell them, hey, there's something you should know about. There are approaches and tools that might help some of these places. But so far, this is a rarity.
Oh, I assumed as much, but thanks for clarifying, confirming that. My second question is specifically about working with African-American churches, AME Zion congregations, and whether you have in the past or whether you would consider in the future specifically a program for that segment? Because as challenging as it is for any congregation to raise money, it seems that it is only exacerbated in terms of African-American churches, and certainly the value to the neighborhoods they're in terms of an active, robust, programmatic, 7 days a week, situation could really be a boon to a lot of those neighborhoods. And I know from those in the area that I'm familiar with here in Central New York, they are close. They're literally close to community centers, and they are already such a big, important part of the neighborhood. Yet they are so many challenges, in terms of infrastructure and so on, even more so than many other congregations.
Right. Well, that's a really good point, and I think the funding community is riper and readier to respond to that argument and to consider funding that kind of program than they were a few years ago, thanks to Black Lives Matter and so much that's happened in the last couple of years. So the answer is yes. I can't be too specific because I don't want to take away their thunder, but a national program providing major grants to historic Black churches will be announced later in June. And our national fund that we do with the National Trust, 20% of the applicants, so these, by the way, are big grants, plus a lot of other services, 20% of the applicants are Black churches. And a number of those that we have brought into the program are Black churches. We hope to begin a program here in Philadelphia, a regional program that would be focused on historic Black churches. Is that enough? No, there's so much more that can be done and should be done. I think this is a good moment. And if anybody in the symposium is interested, we'd be happy to help you make a case for that in your local community, because I think donors and funders would be responsive in a better way than they would have been before. But it's it's a trickle. There's a lot of those churches are as vulnerable as any, as you just said, Gretchen, they're as vulnerable as any other kind of church, perhaps more so because they're under-resourced. I mean, here in Philadelphia, we have 830 historic churches. Half of them, at least half now, are African-American congregations. And in the 1950s and 60s, many of them were large and, very self-sustaining, but not anymore. There's a lot of those. So just like where you are in a big city like Philadelphia, I see the same thing. The only silver lining is I think this is one kind of sacred place that funders will respond to. I think they have a better understanding, as you just said, Gretchen, that these places are central to the health and vitality of communities of color. Very key. It may be hard to convince them with your typical white Lutheran church somewhere, but with an African-American church, I think they understand that better, because most funders are reluctant to get caught up in religion. I've seen that over 40 years of work, and it's just really frustrating, which is why we've talked today about civic value. I think I don't know if I quite said this before, but we have to acknowledge the faith and religion, but we also have to step away from that and say it's more. But in the Black churches case, it's particularly clear.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? I'm sure Michael has one brewing. Oh, Michelle, go ahead.
First off, thank you, Bob, for that excellent presentation. I was wondering, in the event that a congregation that you're working with does decide to sell their building, how involved is your organization in finding a new occupant for the building? And do you ever get involved with adaptive reuse?
The answer is yes. We've had the occasional case of that, but now that we're funded to do transitioning, which can include, in fact, we have one grant is specifically on that question of helping shepherd a building that's becoming vacant into preservation-minded hands. But the transitioning services director, that's part of their job, is to help congregations think about this range of options and also help them, if they do need to leave the building or they do need to sell the building, to help kind of shepherd and help that, and which may include helping them find a new user. So yeah, that's, I think, a growing area of our work. We've done a little of it, but now we're going to have to do more. Things have changed since the 80s when we started in the 89. All the things we're seeing were obvious then, but not as it's not as pronounced as we see it today. So I think we've been moving in this direction more and more. The focus so far has been more on rethinking the use with the congregation still there. And now we're moving more and more to, well, maybe they can't stay. So now what? So, so we've done a little of it, but we're going to have to do a lot more. Although I might add, Michelle, that the basic process that we've tried to pioneer, which is a community-wide engagement process, where if the congregation is going to stay or not stay, in either case, I think it's important to get civic leaders to come together to say, hey, what do we want this to be? What could it be? And having a lot of the right people in the room from every sector, government, philanthropy, health, education, human services, the performing arts, religion, of course, they all need to be in the room because they're going to all bring knowledge about what's happening in the community. And we often say that to congregations. There's a lot of churn. Every community's got churn. Some groups are growing, some are shrinking, some need a new location, some need an annex location. There's a lot of stuff happening. And if you get the right people in the room, they can bring that knowledge and they can bring that connecting ability to you. And I think that's relevant whether the congregation is staying or not. But you do need a group to help do the convening and help structure the conversation and help encourage whatever emerges to really happen. And so I think now that we'll be staffing up to do that, we can do that more often.
Great.
Okay, I see Joe's hand up next.
Hey, Bob.
Hey, Joe.
Great presentation. Good to see you. I remember back when you first started with your organization. So
yes, indeed.
I think we would all be interested in knowing, not to put you on the spot, one congregation you worked with or one project that particularly stands out in your mind. Maybe one of your greatest success stories.
Oh man, after having worked with so many, well, here's a good example that's happening right now. It's a church in Albuquerque. It's Emmanuel Presbyterian, designed by John Gaumin, who was famous for his Pueblo revival. I don't know if you've ever been to Albuquerque, anybody on this symposium, but the University of New Mexico campus started off with a series of Pueblo revival, kind of Art Deco-ish buildings from the 30s and 40s. So that same architect designed this church. And it was built in the 40s and 50s. And it's a typical example of a mainline congregation that's lost a lot of people. So they went from hundreds and hundreds down to like 75 to 100. That's what they have left. And they came to us a couple of years ago to do a lot of the things we're talking about, to help them articulate their value, to help them build the capacity, to help them look at their space, and to do a design charrette. Again, to reconfigure or to think about reconfiguring the space. One of the things that emerged from that is a partnership with the New Mexico Philharmonic. And what's happening now, this is really exciting. Literally as we speak, we're going to work with them to negotiate an agreement where the Philharmonic's going to make this church their primary performance space. Because the sanctuary has fantastic acoustics. It's big, but not too big. It doesn't seem too religious. I mean, there's some religious iconography, but it's not overwhelming. So it has all the right qualities. In Albuquerque, for some reason, there aren't really other good performance spaces of the right size. So the Philharmonic's come to get to know the congregation, loves performing there. And so we're going to be going there this summer. We have a full-time person who does arts in sacred places, matching sacred places with performing arts groups that need a home for rehearsals, performances, offices, whatever. So we do a lot of that work in New York City, for example. So Karen DeLassy, who runs that program, and I are going to go to Albuquerque to help them work out their collaboration with the Philharmonic. And so the church is going to move from the main sanctuary into a smaller, like chapel space. And that's going to become the worship space. So there's a design dimension. as well as a kind of arts dimension. And this is a congregation that worried that they might not last another 5 or 10 years because of their finances. And now they have a new collaborator, new income. They're going to probably be participating in the National Fund for Sacred Places, which is one of our programs. They're going to be able to invest in their building and make it, it's going to be a civic place in a bigger, bolder way than ever before. Now, not every church or synagogue or temple has a philharmonic in its backyard ready to take it on, you know, but it's an example. It's Joe, to go answer your question, this is a dramatic example of what can happen. But I'll tell you, they needed a lot of support along the way. You know, they're small. And I think, and you all in your communities, depending on what your job is, you might find there's a role that you can be playing, because these congregations need a helping hand. They do.
All right, any last questions?
Michael, surely you have a question.
Yes.
Well, I've been waiting patiently. You know, I have dozens of questions, but only two. The first is along the same lines as you've just been speaking, and you know, I mentioned earlier how I was working in Bath, you know, with another one of these churches, Episcopal Church, with students, right? Mm-hmm. Related to that, this year, I was working with a group of students in the EPA Rainwater Challenge. And what do you know, it's the Campus Rainwater Challenge. We won the prize, right? I got money that I didn't expect that I would get. But my point is, I've worked with the ULI competition. I've worked with EPA. I've worked with any number of student groups that are interested in the topics. And it seems to me that in the student groups, you have the seed corn, so to speak, to begin to sensitize another group of people that could help, right? So first question, has there ever been a student competition with religious properties at the focus? Have you ever done that? Or is there a way in which we might work together on that? Just a question.
I love that idea. We've worked with students and thesis projects and studio projects. For example, Susanna, who's on the Symposium, we work with her and when she teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. But a competition like that might have a wider reach, no. I love that idea.
Well, let's, Suzanne and I and you know, can get together Wednesday and to chat about it.
Yeah, I love it.
Because, you know, that's one thing. The second question, you remember, because you started Partners, that there were environmental quality bond acts that were started in New York and New Jersey. Susanna knows it by virtue of the fact that architects were hired to work on church problems rather regularly, and I know that because I was on the review committee for both the New York and the Pennsylvania initiatives that were environmental quality activities. Now, it occurs to me, in light of the current rage in environmentalism that has all to do with climate change and has all to do with, well, disaster mitigation and so on and so forth, right? That there might be an opportunity, because the money is being made available, for this sort of activity to extend to religious properties. And I'm aware of it in a different way because I'm working with tribes in not only this part of the world, but also in other parts of the world, in dealing with the valuation question, which you mentioned also, the valuation in community consciousness, because the tribes are by their very nature completely community oriented in a different way. And that, it seems, I have a PhD student, Dylan, who is a Kiowa Indian, who's doing his dissertation in Oklahoma. Now, you realize, because you worked there, right, that in that part of the country, right, there's a consciousness of the tribal consciousness is much more keen than many other parts of the country. And I'm thinking to myself that the Department of Interior has a role here too, because there has been a complete sea change in the representation by virtue of the Secretary of Interior and, and so on and so forth. So I'm thinking to myself, is there an opportunity that we might think about more constructively to get these people together, to reconfigure the young people who become involved with these kinds of projects?
Well, you're raising a couple good questions. I can probably respond to the first one more than the second. One university that's doing some really interesting work on the question of disaster preparedness and recovery with churches is University of Texas, San Antonio. They've got money from FEMA and the Texas Historical Commission and they've brought us in to help them look at churches along the Gulf Coast, particularly in the Houston area, that, of course, remember the hurricane, I lost track, there have been so many up and down the Gulf Coast, but the one that really drenched the Houston area for days and days with all that rain. So what's interesting is it's partly because of how those buildings have fared, but it's also because those are places where people can be served in the wake of a hurricane. So there's two sides of that coin, right?
Yeah.
They themselves are historic resources, but they are also places that need to be ready to house people and feed people and clothe people when those neighborhoods are devastated. And so I'd be happy to share with you what we've learned from that. And there may be a second phase of work there. So Texas is kind of a case example of of the role that churches can play or should play or have played. And the Native American question, indigenous people question, is a great question. And we've worked with some individual communities, but we've never had a larger national approach to that. So I'm very interested. We just don't have a lot of experience.
Well, thank you. That's terribly helpful in several respects. In a recent conference which I sponsored here, it was a secret conference in a sense, in that it wasn't purposefully advertised. We began to examine the cultural sway of the TIPOs, because many of the TIPOs have, for example, the Onondaga. The Onondaga TIPO representation extends from central New York through to Virginia. And most people in the United States, think about TIPOs as the equivalent of SHPOs, but that's only partially true because of the geographical range of the artifacts that are part of the discussion of community. And to me, it's time to get some rethinking of this with respect to what it is that religious properties mean and what kind of community activity. Because when you look at what goes on in the tribal world, the Native American world, it is not simply the artifacts, there are far more social activities. So I think we have something to learn about here, which could be terribly useful. And it's in part related to public health. The PhD student is actually involved with water rights, as actually Emily Bergeron was years ago in looking at water rights in the Onondaga world. She's now teaching at the University of Kentucky preservation law, but she's been always interested in the question of what community means inside. As a preservation lawyer, she's interested in what it means in that sense. So we'll have a greater chance to chat about all of this when we get together on Wednesday.
Well, and it brings us back to the first presentation on Friday, what Trudy had to say, which I think has been a theme, a leitmotif throughout this whole symposium, is understanding, surveying, assessing, understanding, serving, preserving a broader range of communities, of cultures. And in fact, we're part of a team here in Philadelphia that's going to be learning from San Francisco. Trudy mentioned that on Friday, and other cities that have tried to take a fresh look at how they try to capture what is important to preserve and to lift up. That includes communities that have been overlooked and under-resourced in the past. And certainly religious communities, religious practices, religious places are really key to all that. That's one reason we're involved. It's because, like in communities of color in Philadelphia, the churches are key to this. And that's one reason we're playing a role. So I think I love the fact that I've heard that theme. I wasn't as involved yet in yesterday's presentations, but I heard them, some of them today. It feels like that's one theme that's been coming up again and again.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you guys. I really love this. This has been terrific.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks especially to Bob for wrapping up our symposium today. We ended on such a great note. So I think if there's no further questions, that will conclude our second annual HPPA symposium. So get ready for next year already. That's how we will get it rolling already. 364 days to go. And yeah, just thanks again, everybody. And please stay in touch, and we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you everyone who participated, and thank you again to all of our speakers. This was a really
Thanks, this was great.
Thank you, everybody.
It's like being back in Ithaca.
Thank you.
Without the drive. Bye, guys.
Hi, everyone.